So let's suppose for a second that you are this mischievous watcher, and your goal is to get my feet wet. What kind of methods would you have to achieve that goal? Well, for one, you could rise your tide, and the level you are at all times on average would go past my shoes and it would wet them. And I know for a fact where I'm sitting here, if I pan around and show you, this is usually underwater most of the year. So what could theoretically happen here? Well, for one, ice melting or whatever in the spring, and lots of rainfall and whatever, but that takes a lot of energy. I think we can agree. I think the more opportune and less hard thing to do would be to create a huge wave that just splashes, peaks just directly in front of my feet and splashes them, right? And as this boat comes across, and I'm not sure if the sound is if you can actually hear me quite well, the waves will come in a second. You can see them building here, and that is quite normal. But what will happen is, after the boat lacking about 50 seconds behind, this wave will peak, and then it won't quite get me because I'm smart enough to avoid it. But yeah, so the second thing then means is that you could theoretically achieve this goal by spiking a wave, right? So how does this relate to Overwatch? Well, if we're thinking about, for instance, if you want to win Overwatch, it could be quite feasible to rise your tide, right? So through superior energy, and I think we can agree that it takes a lot of energy to amass this amount of water needed to splash my feet here, you could theoretically completely submerge me, but this would be, I think we can agree, infinitely harder than to splash me with one wave that's coming in, right? So when we are relating this to Overwatch, for instance, we've seen over the season that even a team like NYXL had the ups and downs, had the waves. And to hold that consistent level is almost impossible over the length of the season for several reasons, different patches, sociological reasons, psychological reasons, and as such, it seems rather impossible to achieve the perfect season, for instance. Now, what you could be doing also is to peak in the right moment. And that's why especially analysts have been talking about the ability, for instance, of the LA Valiant to show peaks, because previously they didn't actually peak that high. They would never get my feet wet, right? But now in stage 4, we could argue that they've finally shown that potentiality and that they are a big enough boat to actually achieve that goal, right? So what would you want to be, I guess, is my question here. Obviously, it's a lot harder, it takes a lot more effort to become the rising tide. So the next best thing is simply maybe to incorporate a hybrid system where your natural tide is rising a little, but you also have the peaks. And I think for the best comparison here is AKM and timing. Now, they have a very comparable hero pool. They both play mostly hit scan with a couple of different picks. I mean, AKM plays Pharah here and there. One time was a formidable Roadhog. But for the most part, the relevant picks in Overwatch League, they pretty much overlap. So why is it still valuable to have them both? Well, for one, AKM seemed to be the player that is more contributing to a rising tide. So he's a more consistent player. He's not explosive, not just how he plays, but also how he affects the team. We know that Taimu is the peak player, is the wave that can make the difference. If this guy pops off, I've seen credible arguments made that he actually might look more frightening than Saya play. So that is a great quality then to have. What if the playoffs come and you're on that side, you're on top, right? And you win it all for that reason. And we're thinking about the value of a win against the the missing value of a loss in a playoff situation, that doesn't matter as much. Nobody cares if you get second or third or fourth if in these playoff scenarios. You want players like AKM to get you there, to get you to the playoff season, and then for the peak player, if you can control that, if you can say, okay, Taimu's on today, or Taimu can give you 2 great games, to slot him in there, if there's some controllability, if you have that optionality, it's potentially a great benefit. Now other players don't have that backup, don't have that rising tide player behind them, and therefore their explosiveness sort of went a little bit under. So for instance, we're once again talking about Sire player looks to be a more skilled Widowmaker player, for instance, than Logix, though Logix has the higher win rate with the team. So there's something possibly intangible about his performance, and it's quite possible that Logix raises the tide of the rest of the team as well. Right? So once again, I think when we think about the Overwatch season, how the length is, we have pretty much demonstrated that it isn't a silent or an unmoving lake. It is very much an ocean that keeps on spiking if you can make it, and different waters have different tides, and if it helps you to win, you should absolutely have these joker type of players and employ them into your team, have consistency elsewhere, and therefore be much more effective across the season.